Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 209, Tudor Spring. In our last episode, we saw how Henry VII worked hard to punish his enemies at home while trying to exert English, i.e. Tudor, influence abroad. Today we watch as Henry's reign comes to a rather bitter end. With his death and the ascension of Henry VIII, England truly believes that the worst is over. Winter has ended. Spring has come. As Henry shopped around for better marriages for his family, affairs in Rome had continued apace. It was not a given that Prince Henry would marry a relative of the emperor. It seemed extremely unlikely that the prince would wed anyone in the French royal house. Therefore, the option of Catherine of Aragon needed to be kept open. Unfortunately, Henry's emissaries in Rome had been making a royal mess of things. Henry's chief diplomat, Castellisi, had gotten into an argument with another diplomat. None of this would matter at all, except for the fact that Castellisi decided he would try and slander the other guy by claiming that he had been forging documents and faking the Pope's signature. That wouldn't matter at all, except the problem for Henry was that this guy had been involved in procuring the papal dispensation annulling Catherine's marriage to Arthur. So now, anybody who wanted could argue that that had been a fake. If that was the case, it threw a major monkey wrench into the gears of literally anything that happened from then on out. Henry hated losing control in any situation, and this situation risked him losing one of his cards at the European diplomatic table. Whether or not he still intended to marry Prince Henry to Catherine or not, King Henry wanted to at least make it look like he might, so as to drive up the price. Therefore, in no uncertain terms, he wrote to Castellisi to sort it out. Losing control a bit abroad, King Henry and his ministers decided to clamp down at home. In the fall of 1506, all of our records turned decisively against Henry and Edmund Dudley in terms of public opinion. Things have now started to get really bad. Old laws and statutes long forgotten were now being pulled out of tomes long covered in dust and unused, and enforced with a renewed vigor. Everyone and anyone was now a potential target for Dudley and his minions. When people were hauled before the king's counselors, they were given one choice and one choice only. Quote, fall into agreement. This meant paying fines and accepting financial bonds. They really had no choice. Many men then turned informant to mitigate their own penalties. And so Dudley had now become the king's go-to man for legal and financial matters. He dredged up old statutes and twisted them to Henry's purpose. He looked under every stone for every possible shilling. Theirs was a curious relationship, one defined by their mutual absorption in the law, and by Dudley's ability to distort and twist it to their will. Dudley's account book was a thing of wonder. Pages after pages of fines and payments for every conceivable offense. Export licenses, wardships, marriages, lucrative crowned lands, the king's favor in everything, from royal appointments to the sale of justice, fees for royal pardon for illegal wool sales, and even pardons for murder. In 1506, Henry appointed Dudley president of the King's Council. 2 years after first becoming a royal counselor, a hitherto unknown lawyer had reached the very pinnacle of government. Since the reshuffle at Bray's death, the number of people in debt to the crown had soared, increasing by the hundreds each year. The sheer number of bonds and fees calculated was staggering. For the calendar year 1506 alone, the debt due to the crown for financial obligations was £106,382, which, if all the debts were called, would more than double the king's annual income. And do not think for a moment that Henry's counselors, Dudley chief amongst them, were doing all this pro bono. Oh no, Edmund Dudley was taking a massive cut and extorting men for his own gain as well as Henry's. When a Sussex gentleman was imprisoned for murder, Dudley sold him a pardon in return for the title to all of his estates. As a result, I think we can imagine that whatever the number of the debts owed to Henry was, can be multiplied by at least 1.5 times to figure out the actual number collected. And Dudley could be downright cruel. He and others lured people into making compromising statements with false promises, or badgering them until they sought extra legal means to save themselves, and then they accused them of breaking the law. If you had money in Henry VII's England, you were a marked man. Essentially, Dudley did everything he could, but stopped just short of issuing Roman-style prescription lists. Nowhere felt less safe than London, or more betrayed. London had raised Dudley and trained him to become the lawyer he was. And Dudley knew London's inner workings. He knew its secrets. And now he was using all that against the old city. Throughout London in the fall and early winter of 1506, Dudley's shadow grew and spread like the inexorably spreading darkness of the growing twilight. Fascinatingly, despite everything, business in London continued to boom. To an extent, this economic growth, combined with Dudley's increasing efforts, only served to pour fertilizer on what was already a robust, illicit market. Dudley was aware of all this, and to an extent, he let it happen. He wanted to see just how far the traders and merchants would embroil themselves in illegal activities before he pounced. His goal, and Henry's for that matter, was to get an excuse to increase royal control over the richest city in England. Dudley also knew that London and the London merchants were desperate to avoid this interference. So Dudley understood precisely how much he could squeeze out of the London merchants when it came time to renew their charters, trade privileges, and export licenses. By 1507, most Londoners were remarking how little it mattered who they voted for in terms of city government. Either way, Edmund Dudley was in control. The winter of 1506-07 was one of the warmest in memory. Snow scarcely fell on the ground. There were no winter storms. But the cool, damp weather proved to be disastrous for Henry's health. By January, he had fallen ill. By early March, things had gotten precipitously worse. It seemed that the long-awaited-for moment had finally arrived. In recent years, Lady Margaret had remained closer to her son. Now, in March 1507, she moved into his household again and took over. She supervised his diet and his physicians. She acted like, well, his mother, I suppose. But her presence was not just about seeing to her son's declining health. It was also about ensuring her grandson's smooth transition to power. The death of one monarch was always the riskiest moment in any dynasty. And don't forget, we're hardly 20 years removed from the Wars of the Roses. There are still plenty of people around who would be happy to see a regime change. By mid-March, Henry was at death's door. Interestingly, we get a mention in the records at this time that one of the chaplains closest to Henry was a man whom we're about to know a great deal about. In the records, he's referred to as Master Wolsey. Thomas Wolsey was an Oxford-educated tutor by trade. At some point between 1505 and 1507, Wolsey was appointed royal chaplain for King Henry, a position which gave him considerable access to the king's privy chamber. Ministering to Henry's private devotions, he was in constant attendance. Wolsey, by the winter of 1507, controlled much of the access to Henry. Now, certainly Henry would have considered someone like Edmund Dudley more important. But Dudley was off in London, imprisoning, jaywalkers for non-payment of their fines or something equally laudable. So Wolsey was the one who got to let people in while rebuffing others. It was a significant position of power, of course, because that also meant that Wolsey might know when the king died before anyone else. And that, my friends, is power. Don't get me wrong, though. Dudley was very much in the loop. He followed the developments from Richmond closely, and Dudley, perhaps more than anyone else, was charged with the transfer of power from Henry VII to Henry VIII. There were very few power brokers around the dying king who held so much authority. It was a tall task, too. This was going to be, fingers crossed, the first peaceful transition of power in 100 years. At some point as he lay dying, Henry begged God to spare his life. He swore, Ebenezer Scrooge style, that he would change if he could be given another chance. It did the trick. By the end of March, Henry was out of the proverbial woods. But as Henry recovered, he conveniently forgot all about that deathbed vow, and his ministers returned to their sworn duty of fleecing England. London's prisons began to fill up again. From across England, men were shoved through the gates of the old city, in front of Henry's counselors, and then up to the Tower, or one of the other prisons, quote, where they remained to their displeasures long after. Victims were treated to a pretty consistent procedure. They were tossed in jail and told that they could not be released until they agreed to pay large fines for any supposed crimes, more fines for pardons, and yet more fines for agreeing not to break the law in the future, which is ironic, given that many, if not most of them, had not broken the law in the past. Following the spring crisis of 1507, Dudley emerged as the paramount voice in Henry's inner circle. In summer 1507, Thomas More wrote to a friend on the continent that London had become a city of, quote, sharp eyes. It was a city, literally, infiltrated with royal informants. Men were arrested seemingly at random, their goods confiscated. Dozens died of the stress of all of it. Sometime in late 1507, or early the following year, Thomas More had had enough and left for Paris for a long period of study. Study, at least, had been the excuse. He probably felt like a lot of people did at this time, that it just wasn't the best time to be in England. Best to let things cool down a touch, especially given that Henry VII seemed to be on his last legs. Odds are, he didn't have long to wait. Around the summer or fall of 1507, Dudley turned his attentions to the most venerable of all medieval institutions, the church. Now, to be fair to Dudley, as we already know, many people were critical of the wealth and worldliness of the church. To many, the church had gotten far too political. Plenty of people felt that it needed reform. But Dudley's attitude towards the church was particularly aggressive and, no shocker here, financial in nature. If the church had grown too wealthy, thought Dudley, well, then he was happy to relieve it of some of that gold. Henry looked on approvingly, happy to try and extend royal control over the English church in the way that the French kings enjoyed control over the church in their kingdom. Of course, it's a little ironic, given what is about to happen in the next 2 years, that Henry VIII, not Henry VII, would be the man to extend the rapacious grasp of the English crown over the church. At the time, however, Dudley's attack on church properties was highly unpopular. Though I do seriously question, other than Henry, who still liked the guy at this point. But while Dudley seemed oblivious, or maybe he knew and just didn't care, to the resentment brewing from the church, nobles, merchants, other men at court were not. Richard Fox, chief amongst those at court, saw that the wind had begun to blow against Dudley. If he lost his protector, if Henry died, then what might become of Edmund Dudley? In other words, while Dudley remained mired in the present, eyes fixed on his ledgers, other men had started to look to the future. And they were not alone. Across England, men and women were frankly just looking forward to Henry's death in the hope that normal life would resume. Suffolk was dead. Buckingham and Northumberland under close scrutiny. In reality, there were very few legitimate threats to the Tudor dynasty unless the prince unexpectedly died. But he was a young, virile man at this point, and that seemed unlikely. Everyone was afraid to say anything, even though there weren't any major risks in reality. Everyone was waiting for the thaw. Despite any carefully controlled public appearances, Prince Henry continued to live in his father's gilded cage. And yet disaster still nearly struck. Late one summer evening in July 1506, both king and son were pacing in one of the newly built galleries in Richmond, when the floor, literally, collapsed. They escaped disaster, but barely. But by the spring of 1507, Prince Henry seems to have undergone a transformation. Almost overnight, he turned from boy to man into the Henry VIII we all know. Athletic and ruddy-cheeked, he looked nothing like the wilting Tudor rose his father had become. Prince Henry's new muscular prowess was obvious in the jousting yard. His compatriots felt the power of his blows and saw him easily bend a longbow. The prince, it was clear, wanted to hit harder, shoot and joust better than anyone else. But King Henry was never going to give his son the chance to test his skills in a tournament. No, that was far too much for the cautious and skittish king. While his friends charged each other in plate armor on either side of a wooden tilt, Prince Henry would sit and watch. To be fair to the king, Henry did not intend any of this to belittle his son. He was just too valuable to lose. Plenty of kings and princes had already died jousting. With death obviously approaching him, the king was not willing to roll the dice. Still, when a major tournament was held in June 1507, it was clear who the combatants wanted to impress. King Henry had recovered, but his son was the future, and everyone seemed to know it. One contemporary wrote, quote, "Every man of them was more ready, perceiving that our Prince Henry should him behold," end quote. But there was also a lot of anger in the tournament that June. This tournament proved to be one of the bloodiest in memories. Pieces of armor were shorn off, swords splintered and broke, combatants literally hacking away at one another. To many of the king's counselors, this looked like a deliberate poke in King Henry's eye. These events were supposed to be examples of a chivalrous and just kingdom. Evidently, these men felt the kingdom was far from just, so why should they be chivalrous? And of course, underneath the veneer of the organized joust lay violence. Men, especially young men like Buckingham and Northumberland, were absolutely fed up. Certainly, Henry's counselors wondered how much more they would take. Most of this was just lost on Prince Henry, by the way. He loved the tournament for what it was. The more violent, the better. According to all accounts, he couldn't take his eyes away. In many ways, people began looking at the prince and wondering if he just wasn't much more descended from his mother than his father. His mother had been a York, and the prince, to many, seemed like Edward IV reincarnated. He was a physical specimen. He acted with a relaxed informality. Later on, those around Henry would witness that he had inherited, well, a few more by the way of his maternal grandfather's attributes, as we'll get to. By July, Henry, Lady Margaret, Prince Henry, and their retinues were on a tour of the countryside. By August, they were in Kent. King Henry, for all the trouble it had given him, still loved Kent, mostly because it boasted a few excellent hunting lodges. Henry, in the summer of 1507, seemed like he had totally recovered. In fact, he seemed like he was in better health than he had been in years. According to one source, he had, quote, grown fat. Between incessant hawking and hunting, the king continued to deal with the business of state. And one such affair was the Earl of Kent. The Earl of Kent had, again, been a ward of the king as a boy, and the king's ministers had, again, systematically sold off all his lucrative estate management jobs to the highest bidder, at prices, by the way, that Kent would never be able to afford to buy them back for. With no other alternative, Kent had to take out massive loans just to stay afloat. It was the perfect storm that Henry and his ministers always loved to create. In August 1507, Henry declared that, given his inability to manage his own finances without mortgaging his properties, all of Kent's estates, etc., 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 would be henceforth managed by the crown. Permanently. On top of that, Henry imposed a number of particularly insulting conditions on the young man. He had to present himself at court every day and was forbidden to leave without written authorization. There was little that Kent could do but fume. By late August, Henry was at Woodstock, one of the royal standing houses. This was a favorite place for Henry to hunt, and he frequented it often. It's notable for our purposes because it was at Woodstock in late August 1507 when Catherine finally joined the party. For Catherine of Aragon, things had gotten desperate. She had been in England for 6 years, was now 22 years old, and essentially had become part of the furniture. Henry's vision for England's future was now firmly set on an Anglo-Hapsburg alliance, in which there seemed to be no place for Catherine. Making matters worse, Ferdinand had missed yet another installment payment in her dowry that April. Until that was paid, Henry was never going to consider going forward with the marriage. Upon receiving this news, Catherine wrote a desperate letter to her father. Henry, she wrote, no longer treated her as part of the family, but rather with a sort of polite indifference. She was refused access to the prince even though, quote, he lived in the same house as her. Catherine believed she had one last card to play. Henry was keen to remarry, and the mad Queen Juana was definitely on his radar. Catherine hoped that if she brokered this match, then perhaps she would still be able to help herself in the process. Henry told Catherine that while a marriage to Margaret of Savoy would be nice, he preferred Juana. In fact, by 1507, Henry had begun to fixate on a marriage with Juana, with the European domination such a match might bring. Catherine realized she could parlay this interest into value for herself. What followed was what probably seems to us today a rather exceedingly polite exchange between Catherine and Ferdinand. Ferdinand, in one of the letters to his daughter in 1507, sort of offhandedly mentioned that he might marry Juana off to Louis XII's nephew and forge an alliance with France. Evidently, he wrote this in such a way as one might say they might vacation in France next summer, for example. Catherine was floored. She wrote back immediately, begging Ferdinand not to marry Juana to the French. If that happened, then all her hopes were dashed. Instead, she implied, he should consider marrying Juana to Henry. Late that August, Catherine finally cornered Henry and demanded to know what he was going to do. He met her with the air of a benevolent uncle and told her point blank that Ferdinand had requested another 6-month extension of the dowry payment and that he had granted it. He was blunt. Neither he nor his son was bound by any marriage contract until the balance of the dowry was paid. End of story. Sadly, Ferdinand's procrastination in all this had as much or more to do with disorganization than any efforts at deception. He tended to just dump huge chests full of state paperwork at whatever house he was staying at the time. We get upset today about politicians not using secure email servers. And here was the King of Spain literally losing huge quantities of paperwork by toting it around with him everywhere. For example, by 1507, Ferdinand had managed to lose the Treaty of Medina del Campo, the first marriage agreement between England and Spain, signed almost 20 years before. He lost it. But there were politics at work here too. Ferdinand was dismayed by Princess Mary's impending marriage to Charles of Ghent, soon to be Castile, soon to be Holy Roman Emperor. The idea, then, that Henry might marry Juana filled him with horror. If that happened, we'd all be talking about the Spanish Tudor dynasty right now. Henry, for his part, tried to paint a new Spanish-Anglo alliance in the best possible light. He wrote Ferdinand that he would even go to war on his behalf. So Catherine and Henry, in an effort to sell this idea, embarked on what we would consider the early modern equivalent of a media blitz, each desperately lobbying Ferdinand for the match. Catherine saw her fate as now inseparable from England and believed everything hinged on King Henry's marriage to Juana. If she could cement it, she believed, her marriage to Prince Henry would surely follow. Ferdinand responded to them both in the same way. He wasn't sure that he could persuade Juana to remarry. What he left out of these letters was that Ferdinand was essentially keeping the woman under lock and key as he pressed his own claim to Castile. But, he said, if Juana could be persuaded, then Henry would certainly be first in line. That is to say, if Ferdinand let her out of her room. Through the late summer and autumn of 1507, King Henry slowly made his way up and down the Thames, staying in a variety of local royal residencies. Prince Henry trailed him, never more than a short ride away, in the event that his perpetually ill father took a turn for the worse. Prince Henry was now 16 years old, and the model prince. He was magnificent in ceremonies, which, unlike his father, he reveled in. He was chivalrous and pious, or, at the very least, he made sure he looked like he was. Prince Henry was all too aware that he was constantly being watched, and that the news of any transgressions would get back to his father immediately. In December 1507, Richard Fox returned from Calais, bearing the new Treaty of Perpetual Peace between England and the Holy Roman Empire. At the heart of this new Anglo-Hapsburg agreement was the marriage of Princess Mary to Charles of Ghent. Their proxy marriage, he was now at this point 9 years old, was slated to take place at Easter 1508. Maximilian's correspondence around the time is candid, to say the least. He told Margaret of Savoy, his daughter and the woman to whom he was still trying to marry King Henry to, that he agreed to all this to get a, quote, good sum of money, end quote, from Henry. Maximilian was up to his eyeballs in debt and desperately needing the money to keep his kingdom and his never-ending battle with France going. Henry's aim, as always, were more complex. Maximilian had been unable to travel to Rome and pay the Pope to crown him Holy Roman Emperor officially because he couldn't foot the bill. Henry stepped in, paying for the trip and the bribes, with the goal not only of getting the emperor to be the emperor, and therefore on his side, but also the Pope. And true to his word, Maximilian crossed the Alps in the spring of 1508 at the head of an army, paid for by Henry. He dispossessed Venice of much of its territories, with papal backing, of course, and then made his way to Rome. Henry had scored a triumph without ever firing a shot. Unfortunately, as we know, Maximilian does not have long to live. And at the moment, it looked like Henry did not either. In the chill damp of the new year, Henry's tuberculosis returned once more. His public appearances, always infrequent, were now fleeting. News of his physical condition leaked out and weren't good. He was breathing with difficulty, unable to eat, and had grown weak and emaciated. He suffered from terrible arthritis of the hip joints, making movement extremely painful. For many at this point, Henry seemed like a name only. Frankly, it didn't seem like he wanted to be seen. For those that caught a glimpse of him, hollow-cheeked, blue eyes burning, he seemed more dead than alive. There were days when he could haul himself to his feet to shout at someone who had displeased him, but most days he was incapacitated. In a sure sign of the gravity of the situation, Lady Margaret once more descended on Richmond and took control of Henry's care. Toward the end of February, a new ambassador arrived from Aragon with renewed hope for Catherine. There may be a chance now that Ferdinand could and would pay the dowry. This pleased Henry, who brought the prince in on the conversation. Suddenly, after years of standing on the sidelines, it looked like Catherine might be able to get into the game. But for that to happen, Henry insisted that the dowry would need to be paid in full and in cash. To be frank, by this point, Henry had grown to distrust and even detest King Ferdinand, who had continually slighted him with his constant procrastinations and barely believable excuses. All the while, Henry's health continued to worsen. Easter came and went, and the king was still withdrawn. By April, his physical condition had begun to improve somewhat, but he was still rarely seen. As the king declined, so the prince only seemed to grow in strength and stature. In May 1508, the Earl of Kent broke his arm while practicing with the prince in the yard. Whatever the king's advisors thought of Prince Henry, clearly he had grown up. By summer 1508, King Henry's patience with the emperor was wearing thin. Despite promises, no ambassador from Margaret of Savoy had appeared for a proxy marriage. He wrote to Maximilian that if he did not take action soon, Henry would just make a deal with the King of France instead. To a large extent, this was bluster. Henry was well aware that he was dying in summer 1508. In fact, he had less than a year to live. That May, Edmund Dudley completed the book of accounts he started nearly 4 years earlier. The numbers were staggering. Through endless complex proliferation of finds that he had ferreted out on the king's behalf, Dudley had accrued a staggering £219,316 and 6 shillings in amounts owed to the crown. This increased the annual income of the crown by 50%. Consider the following statistic. In the first 15 years of Henry's reign, 870 people had been bound in debt to the crown. From the time of Arthur's death and Suffolk's flight around 1501-1502, that number had increased to 3,500, basically quadrupling. And Dudley showed no signs of slowing down. Recently, he hired a new official, Edward Belknap, cut from the same mold. His goal was to create a national network of deputies, men who would look into the darkest corners and investigate all possible abuses. Dudley wanted Belknap to find each and every instance where bonds could be imposed and fines taken. Crucially, Belknap would not receive a salary. He was working purely on commission from the amounts he brought in for the king. The financial incentives were obvious. And Belknap's books, well, they would be audited, but only by King Henry. The perfect storm of graft and corruption had arrived. And after 1508, Dudley and Belknap turned their attentions almost exclusively to ecclesiastical wealth. By the end of July, Henry was well enough to leave Richmond, and not a moment too soon. The dreaded sweating sickness, the one that had claimed the life of Arthur, had once more struck London. People collapsed in the streets, tumbled up horses as they rode. Men and women ate lunch at 11 in the morning, with every appearance of being healthy, and by nightfall, they were dead. It was a good time to get out of the city. Henry was extremely anxious and issued an edict. No one traveling from London was to be admitted to the royal precincts except physicians. Given what happened to his eldest son, I understand the concern. By the end of August, the disease had disappeared. And so with the end of summer, King Henry went back to Greenwich with a renewed, almost maniacal determination. He set about then putting the final pieces of his daughter's marriage treaty into place with Charles of Ghent. The man that Henry trusted with the mission to Calais to meet with the emperor's people was none other than Thomas Wolsey. He accomplished the feat with almost superhuman speed. Wolsey left Richmond around noon and arrived back 3.5 days later, arriving in the dead of night. Finally, it seemed, the Hapsburg diplomatic wheels were turning. In early December, after another ratification of the Treaty of Calais, imperial ambassadors stepped off their ship into Kent. Everything was set for the proxy wedding between Princess Mary and Charles of Ghent/soon-to-be Castile. The festivities would rival those of Catherine and Prince Arthur's marriage 7 years earlier. So it was, on December the 17th, 1508, Princess Mary was formally betrothed to Charles of Ghent. Mary, eventually, if all this went into place, would be the queen of an empire that would span Christendom, stretching from the southern tip of Spain to the borders of Poland and Hungary and back through Naples. Throughout all the festivities, Prince Henry and Catherine were relegated to the status of wallflowers. Mary had lapped them both, and I don't think anyone can doubt that Catherine harbored not a little envy for her, maybe, sister-in-law. Certainly, she saw Mary's union with Charles as another nail in the coffin that was becoming her own marriage prospects. The imperial ambassadors left England in January of 1509. With them, the energy of the preceding months seemed to seep out of Richmond like air from a balloon. Henry's roller coaster had reached its final hill. In the winter damp, Henry fell ill again. The symptoms were all too familiar. Tuberculosis, combined with a suffocating inflammation of the throat. As he had the previous 3 winters, Henry sensed death approaching. Henry's preparations for death had modified and developed over the past 10 years, but had always been meticulous to the letter. In this, Henry actually just mirrored the attitudes of the age. People were terrified by the idea of death coming suddenly and unexpectedly. To prepare yourself for death, the very battleground of the human soul between God and the devil, this was the stuff of life itself. One leading authority at the time wrote, "Learn to die, and thou shalt learn to live." Again, it bears repeating, England was hardly 20 years removed from a brutal civil war. If Henry VIII succeeded his father peacefully, it would be the first time that it happened in 100 years. There remained the possibility of a challenge to the throne, however. Suffolk, he was locked up in the Tower, but his brother Richard was floating around Europe. Buckingham gave the impression that he wanted nothing more than the crown and the heads of all of Henry's counselors on the chopping block. There were a lot of men who had very good reasons to hate Henry VII. But then again, it didn't have to be civil war because, on the other hand, Henry's death was going to bring about a regime change either way. Prince Henry had given almost no indication that he wanted to continue the system his father had sustained. He was far more interested in the glory of kingship. And so, in the end, most of the nobles at court appeared to be satisfied with whoever the new king was, so long as it was not Henry VII. By the beginning of Lent, the king had recognized that he was going to die. At the end of February, the royal household moved downriver to Richmond so that the king could pass away in his favorite estate. Few glimpsed Henry from then on. When ambassadors from Maximilian and Margaret of Savoy arrived on March the 6th, 1509, Henry would not even see them. One of the casualties of Henry's decline was Catherine. After 7 years in England, and at the age of 23, she would now return to Spain. The reason for this change has less to do with Henry at this point as a decision maker. Henry had not decided to send Catherine home. He was losing control. The factionalism that had been brewing in Henry's court for the past 2 years, as he passed in and out of near-death episodes, now exploded to the forefront. By the end of March, Henry's days were absolutely numbered. Unable to eat and struggling for breath, the king's mind focused on the hereafter. On Easter Sunday, April the 8th, 1509, Henry collapsed in pain in his privy closet. He dropped to his knees and crawled to receive the sacrament. That day he was rushed to his bed where he remained under a pile of blankets and covers, begging God for one more chance. He swore that if he recovered, he would reform his ways. He would find new ministers of the law. I'm not sure whether God was listening, or if he or she remembered the last promises that Henry made. Either way, it was clear that God would not intervene this time. Ministers pored over his last will and testament, revised for the final time on March the 31st, just 8 days before. The will itself was not Henry's best work. It was clear to anyone reading that the king's mind was slipping. Henry had been such a perfectionist for so long that all his mistakes were even more glaring. The will was riddled with copyist errors left uncorrected. He'd even failed to fill in the date of Mary's proxy marriage to Charles of Ghent, even though he thought that was one of the most important events of his reign, and it only happened a few months earlier. In the public sphere, there were all the usual signs that the king was about to die. A general pardon was proclaimed on April the 16th. In years before, people had gotten accustomed to these periods of pardon before the king recovered and his ministers went back at it. But this time, everyone seemed to sense that things were different. Lords and merchants scrambled to court to enroll their names on the pardon list. This one was going to be permanent, and people knew it. By the evening of April 20, Henry was fading fast. He made an exemplary medieval death, eyes fixed intently on the crucifix held before him, kissing it fervently and beating it against his chest. Remember, still through the early modern period, People believed that how you died was an indication as to whether you were saved or damned. Henry had every intention of having a good death. Around 11 p.m. on April the 21st, Henry VII died. Crucially, there was hardly anyone around him. Notably absent were the two men who had been so central to his financial schemes, Dudley and Empson. The only people who knew of Henry's death were those present in the Privy Chamber, chief amongst them, Richard Fox. They now had a brief opportunity to ensure an orderly succession and to position themselves around the new king. It's what Henry VII would have wanted, and it would ensure their own survival. These men decided that they would keep Henry's death a secret for 2 days. In 2 days' time, it just so happened that many great magnates of the realm were expected at court. That would be the perfect time to swiftly and efficiently carry out the succession. Everyone's submission of loyalty to the new King Henry VIII could be secured in person and in the moment. Meanwhile, in London, Dudley and Empson were starting to get nervous. By April 22nd, rumors were coming into London that the king was dead, though of course Fox wouldn't confirm these. Still, both men realized that this could be a very dangerous time for them. Dudley sent out orders to assemble a large group of men, quote, arrayed in the manner of war, end quote, and to await his further command. In the meantime, he also gathered up large amounts of weapons in his house. 60 spiked and bladed mauls, over 150 bows, a mix of longbows and crossbows, and 35 sheaves of arrows. 35 arrows per sheaf meant that Dudley now had an arsenal of 840 arrows. He was certainly preparing for the worst. On April 23rd, groups of important English nobles made their way to Richmond as planned. After they began to assemble, Fox found his way to Archbishop Warham, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and told him that several important men needed to speak with him inside the king's chambers. What he found was a dead Henry VII. Then Fox told him the plan. Shortly after the prince would arrive, Prince Henry had no clue that his father was dead. They would usher Henry inside the chambers, break the news to him, and immediately re-emerge to proclaim him king. The nobles would have no choice but to consent, with the power of the state, Fox, and the church, Warham, both supporting Henry. Soon the prince arrived and he was ushered in as planned. When he saw his father, he remained stone-faced. Fox explained the plan, and he consented. Moments later, the men emerged from the privy chambers into the presence chamber, where everyone else waited. There, per the plan, they hailed Henry as King Henry VIII, not as prince. Finally, King Henry's death was announced. So that part of the plan went off without a hitch. But the status of the crown remained precarious. What happens next is that a key group comes together to form a circle around the new king. This small group consisted of counselors, people like Lady Margaret, Archbishop Warham, and Richard Fox. Obviously, all the decisions were still technically left to Henry VIII. But he was too young and inexperienced to suddenly and decisively be able to make all these choices for himself. So in reality, on April 23rd, 1509, the Kingdom of England was ruled by a small cabal of individuals, not King Henry VIII. Henry, in fact, was relocated the next day to the Tower of London for his protection. While he waited, surrounded by armed guards, Lady Margaret et al. Went out implementing the terms of the late king's will. But the first thing that they did was send out a message announcing Henry VII's death, and, crucially, a message that the new regime would not be like the old one. It was essential that Henry VIII distance himself from his father's policies and hated ministers. And so they needed a scapegoat for the whole thing. And it just so happens that there were two standing right here, Empson and Dudley. Early on April 24th, the roundup started. The Duke of Buckingham's brother, Henry Stafford, was arrested as a potential troublemaker, but he wasn't the big fish. That was just a precaution. As dawn rose over London, armed royal guards slipped into the city and made their way to Empson and Dudley's respective houses. They quickly surrounded each. Then, at the appointed time, the men executed their orders. First, there was some hammering on doors. Then household servants, still wiping sleep from their eyes, opening the bolts, and then the men pouring in. Whatever plans the two counselors had put in place were useless. By 9 a.m., they were both on their way to the Tower. In London that morning, Henry VII's death and the succession were proclaimed. On the 25th of April, the good news began. Henry VIII signed his first official document, granting pardon to basically everyone his father had hunted and berated for years. It was deliberate and carefully worded. It explained, in tone as much as substance, that the old days were gone. Henry VIII would not be like Henry VII. The pardon stressed that normal judicial service had been restored. No more secret courts and councils. No more looking over your shoulder. Everything would be done in the open, in the clear light of day. There would be no prying into ancient laws anymore. No more informants. Winter was over. Spring had come to England. By the morning of April the 26th, thousands of copies of said proclamation were in circulation. As men were released from the Tower, a mood of retribution hung in the air. Notably absent from the general pardon proclamation were the names of Dudley and Empson, as well as their closest associates. The new regime was trying desperately to pin everything on those two and their minions. So far, it was working. From the Tower, King Henry VIII and his entourage moved to Greenwich, where the new government really started to take shape. Everyone around Henry remarked at his sudden transformation. Now suddenly able to step out of his father's shadow, Henry was determined to make a break with the past. Thomas More observed, quote, "However dutiful he was before, the king has a character which deserves to rule." The new king told everyone present that, as soon as he was crowned, he intended to make war on France. And don't forget, he reminded everyone, his father left him a fortune. He intended to spend it. Everyone knew that Henry VII had been rich. But thanks to his murky accounting methods, no one knew exactly how rich the dead king was. But Henry VIII was confident of his fortune, and so he likewise announced that he was wiping the slate more or less clean. Everyone whose name made it into Dudley's accounting books would find said name erased. The new king was quickly becoming all things to all men, someone easy to love. And as the king announced all these decisions, Richard Fox stood at his side. More than anyone else, he had realized early on just how crucial it was to be close to the young king. But the person who experienced the biggest change was Catherine. Suddenly, Catherine found herself barreling toward marriage. Henry's men informed the Spanish ambassador brusquely that Henry didn't care about red tape. He was sure the dowry would be paid at some point. What he cared about was allying himself with Spain and starting war with France as soon as possible. The Spanish minister was dumbstruck. Fox spelled it out for him. "You must remember now," he said, "the king is king and not prince. One must speak in a different way in this matter than when he was prince. Until now, things were discussed with his father, and now one must treat with him who is king." Fox was pointing out the obvious, but it wasn't obvious to everyone. The old king was dead. Long live the king. It was time to get used to a new reality. Henry VIII didn't care for accounting books and numbers. He wanted to spend his time in pursuit of virtue and glory. The new king was no micromanager. He would leave the affairs of state to his ministers. So long as they pleased him, of course, as we will shortly see. There seems to be little doubt that Henry, at the very least, liked the idea of Catherine. He liked the idea of marriage, with his parents' example in the back of his mind. His marriage to Catherine took place with astonishing speed. On June the 11th, Archbishop Warham married the couple in a private ceremony at Greenwich. The king wanted a wife, her dowry, and Spanish support for a war against France. Henry was in such a rush to be married. He was wed before he was formally crowned, which happened on June the 24th, 1509. Enthroned alongside his queen on a high stage, Henry VIII took the traditional oaths and promised to defend the laws of the land and, ironically, quote, especially the customs and liberties of the church. We'll see about that. For so many at court, it seemed like a massive weight had been lifted from England's shoulders. Thomas More wrote, "As spring is banished and returns, winter at regular intervals returns as it was before. Many revolutions will come again." There was no doubt in anyone's mind that spring had finally come to Tudor England. More than his father, Henry VIII's reign would banish memories of the Wars of the Roses for good. In the hands of Henry VIII's poets, the Age of Rebirth began in 1509, not 1485. Over the following months, the late king's financial grip over a number of prominent nobles relaxed. A series of bonds were cancelled, including, notably, those of Buckingham and Northumberland. Henry VII's political prisoners were likewise released. On July 8th, King Henry established a commission to investigate abuses of power under his predecessor. In particular, these commissions were to investigate potential violations of the Magna Carta, the compact between the crown, nobles, and subjects of England. Technically, this has all been required under Henry VII's will, but the new king wanted to make it clear that he being underlined and bold, was going to clean the proverbial slate. Now, to be clear, these commissions were not designed to blame the dead king. Their goal was to put all the blame for everything that had gone wrong over the past decade onto the shoulders of Empson and Dudley, as well as their associates. King Henry had his two scapegoats on hand. He didn't need to go searching for anybody else. 4 days after the commissions were established, Empson and Dudley were hauled out of the Tower and arraigned. Henry's new counselors, chief amongst them Richard Fox, had no interest in an actual trial. So what they did was turn evidence of graft and financial crimes into evidence of high treason. Then the two men could be tried and executed with little to no procedure. Of course, Dudley and Empson both pleaded not guilty. Nobody wanted to listen to them. And given that it was a treason trial, no one had to. Both men were summarily pronounced guilty, sentenced to being drawn and quartered, then dragged back to the Tower. Dudley at least attempted to write a defense, or if not defense, then at least an explanation of his conduct. In it, he seems to admit that he's a dead man, but he writes anyway. His explanation, for lack of a better analogy, sounds like that of most of the Nazis at Nuremberg. I was only following orders. If Dudley had hoped to jog the councillor's conscience, it was a vain hope. The same month that Dudley wrote his plea, Empson's palatial manor on the Thames was appropriated. Its new owner? A certain Sir Thomas Wolsey. That autumn, Henry VIII did away with all the old cloudy and nebulous committees that had once thrived under his father. Transparency. That was to be the order of the day. The committee pored over all the old debts from Dudley's ledgers. Henry VIII and his advisors certainly were not about to just cancel all of them. That would have resulted in a substantial economic loss. So instead they kept all the debts, quote, grounded firmly in the law, though they expunged a huge number. It's important to note that the Crown's power was still much stronger in 1509 than it had been in 1485. Parliament rolled back certain unjust laws, but for every one that it rolled back, it kept 2 or 3 in place. Several efforts to roll back Henry VII's laws were actually vetoed by his son, including a bill confirming the Church's liberties. And as we will see, Henry VIII is not yet done with the Church. But I'm guessing you knew that. As for Empson and Dudley, after a botched attempt at escape, they met their end on August the 18th, 1510. Both were brought out to the scaffolding on Tower Hill and summarily beheaded before the jeering crowds. And with them dies all the sins of Henry VII. Or at least that was the official message. On October the 8th, 1621, Henry VII's first biographer, a man by the name of Sir Francis Bacon, presented his just completed History of the Reign of Henry VII to James I. In it, Bacon refers to Henry VII as a unifying king, the man who ended the Wars of the Roses. In English history, Henry VII is the man that everybody would rather just forget. He is, even from the pages of every history book that I've read on him, totally devoid of any sort of personality. There are paintings of him, but from all the descriptions, you almost have an impossible time even trying to figure out what he must have been like, what he must have looked like. Henry VII seems much more like a bureaucrat than a Renaissance king, and in so many ways, I suppose he was. But it's easy to forget that he was absolutely the product of the Wars of the Roses. Henry VII proved to be the last king to get on top of England's first Game of Thrones, but at the time, there's no way of knowing that that was going to be the case. The machine could have just kept on churning. Why we don't remember Henry VII in a better light is because I don't think we understand him very well. And because, as I mentioned, he's just dwarfed by the immense personality that is his son, Henry VIII, whose memory we don't remember all that well either. I'll talk about that a lot next episode. But I think Henry VII doesn't get enough credit in a lot of ways for finally stabilizing England. We might not agree with his methods, certainly I don't. But if you had to choose between Henry VII and the horrors of the Wars of the Roses, well, I think the choice is obvious.